Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm your host, Samantha Reigle. I've spent more than 20 years as a mediator helping people resolve conflict. And here I talk about why conflict and distress show up at all and how changing the way we respond can make life a whole lot easier. It's been a crazy week, and I have some cases that I mediated that I thought I would share with you today. One is about using drugs at work, and the other is about a landscaper trying to use his work connections to get his own business started and basically got caught by his employer. So buckle up and enjoy the show. Let's get started. All right, this is another Diaries of a Mediator episode. When I first introduced this series, I told you I've had a front row seat to just about every flavor of human behavior, and I meant it. The things that people do, the stories they tell themselves, and the patterns that they repeat endlessly is pretty fascinating. But what I really want this series to show you is what these conflicts are actually pointing to underneath the surface, the misalignment, the shifts, the wake-up calls, the you've grown out of this, but you're still hanging on moments, And today I want to talk about two cases that look nothing alike on paper, but together they paint a really clear picture of how conflict can move us or try to move us from being misaligned to getting more in alignment with what actually works for us. So, when I talk about conflict, I'm not necessarily talking about two people screaming at each other. That does happen. But I do want to talk about conflict in more broad terms, how it's defined by impact, right? So it can be a rift, it can be a fracture, a disruption, anything that shakes up the reality that you've been operating in. And sometimes it can be dramatic, but most of the time it's probably subtle, maybe a policy shift, a boundary someone finally enforces, a consequence you didn't anticipate, a moment where life said to you, hey, this isn't working anymore, even if you weren't ready to hear it. So, I want you to think of conflict as this sort of interruption that snaps you out of any kind of autopilot that you've been living in and gives you the ability to see that you have been living in autopilot, basically. And these two cases that I'm going to go over today, I think do exactly that in two different ways. Let's start with the first one. A company tells its employees that since recreational marijuana is legal in the state that they operate in, that they've decided they're not going to do random drug tests anymore, unless there's like a specific reason. Now, this workplace is a warehouse, and there are times when employees have to drive forklifts to move pallets around. So as you can imagine, people hear that and they relax. The employees took that at face value. Life went on. 2 years passed without incident. Then one morning, drug paraphernalia shows up in the warehouse where 19 employees worked, including the one who later filed the complaint. So suddenly, that vague clause of we're not going to test our employees anymore kind of changed, right? Because now there's this reason. There's drugs in the workplace. An employer has to take the necessary steps because of safety provisions. And they decided to test all the employees, the 19 employees, including the supervisors. Everyone was tested, and 6 people failed. They were all different races. Some were supervisors, like I said, including the complainant. All were terminated. So during the mediation, I was talking with the complainant about the situation, and he was explaining how he would have never engaged in recreational marijuana use if he was going to be tested at work. He had worked for the company for 16 years, worked himself up the ladder into a lead position. He valued his job. He wouldn't have put it in jeopardy for anything. He was extremely frustrated and felt targeted and set up. And all these emotions are indeed validated by what happened to him. He had no other discipline on his record, and then he was terminated because of this failed drug test. But the cool part about this guy is that he was out of work for about 3 months and then landed an even better job with better prestige at a higher salary. And he later told me he was happier at this new job. And not just making the best of it happy, I mean genuinely noticeably happy. more aligned with the work, more respected, better pay, better energy. You know kind of where I'm leading you, right? He had become completely stagnant in his old job because he truly believed that was the ceiling for him, that he had reached his potential and that this was as good as it gets. He wasn't miserable, he was settled. And sometimes settled is even harder to walk away from. It wasn't until he was confronted with the turmoil of being terminated, that emotional jolt, that disruption to his stable reality, that he realized he had so much more in him. So that conflict of the termination, that rupture in his reality, forced a kind of clarity he couldn't access while he was comfortable. Losing the job didn't take something from him. It revealed the potential he didn't know he had. The disruption did the part he couldn't bring himself to do. And that's what misalignment does. It whispers, and then eventually, if you ignore the whisper long enough, it knocks. Now, let me take you into what was happening in my noggin during the mediation, because this is the part that, people rarely get to hear. From the moment he came into the mediation, I could feel he wasn't actually fighting for the job. He was seeking closure. 16 years is a long time to give a company, and even though the circumstances shocked him, the energy was already moving him forward. What he needed, it was recognition of his contribution. And this is where the mediator role becomes an art form. I don't signal who I agree with. I'm not there to judge the decision, but I am there to validate the experience. It's his truth, his lens, his emotional reality, and that deserves space. And when I see a need like that, I guide the room in a way that allows it to be met respectfully. So one of the tools we use as mediators is what we call stroking the ego, which really just means communicating in a way that preserves someone's dignity. And the company's executives stepped into that beautifully. They acknowledged his years of service, expressed genuine regret that things ended this way, and spoke to the value that he had brought to the team for so many years. And you could see the effect immediately. The tension softened. This complainant, he felt seen. He didn't defend his actions. He didn't justify them. He just felt settled and seen. So behind the scenes, I kept coaching him gently, helping him stay grounded, encouraging him as he navigated the negotiation, and reminding him he was moving towards closure. And by the end, that's exactly what he got. Now, this was a monetary settlement, and he got a good chunk of change. He was happy for that. I mean, no amount of money, you can ask anyone who's been terminated and they're seeking a monetary settlement. They want it to be so substantial that they feel like all the pain that they went through was worth it on some level. And I always try to communicate to people that there's not going to be any amount of money. It's not going to be like a win the lottery situation today, but what we might be able to achieve for you is the amount of money that will help you grin and bear it and swallow it and be able to move on with your life. That's, 98% of the mediations that I do. So he was happy because he heard from them about how much he was appreciated, and then he was given a significant amount of monetary compensation for essentially his years of service. There's no admission of guilt in these mediations, admission of violation of the statute. It's more along the lines of kind of categorized as severance in a sense. So, we wish you well and we're both going our separate directions. So it worked out. And I thought that this was like a really good example to show you how, life was setting him up for something more aligned for him, and he wouldn't have gone after it on his own. He needed this rupture, this disruption in his life to happen to kickstart his next chapter. So I think that's a really cool thing. And if you're able to think about a termination that way, it can be a sense of relief, and it can be exciting, and it can be like, what's going to happen next, and kind of shift your perspective from it being a negative experience to a more positive experience. All right, let me dig into the next case because it's going to reveal the same pattern just in a completely different way. This mediation involved a landscaping business, and one of the landscapers, it was a very small business. So one of this landscapers, he filed a complaint. He'd only worked there 4 years, but this company, being such a small business, kind of treated him like family. They really took care of him. They gave him advances on his paychecks when he needed them. They let him take time off to run his own contracts because they knew that he was trying to branch out on his own. They covered for him when he didn't show up to work. They really wanted him to succeed, but they were running a business too, right? Generosity only works when there's balance, and that's where things broke down. Eventually, the owners of this landscaping business started to feel taken advantage of. Jobs were being disrupted. The business was losing money. He was even suggesting to their own clients to hire him directly for cheaper prices. Like he was trying to drum up his own business using their clients. When he was caught doing that, they explained all this to him multiple times about how they were not going to tolerate this behavior. Unfortunately, it continued, and it all culminated when they realized he just picked up and went away on vacation without getting approval and only found out about it. They had to, trace him down, and it took like 3 days. Of course, at that point, they had reached their limit, terminated him for excessive absenteeism, among other things. And he communicated to me that he was actually completely blindsided by this termination, completely shocked. He believed that maybe he was fired because of his age, and he held on to that explanation tightly because it kept him from having to look at his own role and what happened. And this is where the conflict as a portal theme shows up again, but in a different expression. He was given multiple opportunities, guys, to shift his behavior, multiple chances. He was told exactly what needed to change, but he was unwilling to see this imbalance. So he had multiple openings to grow out of an outdated belief that I can play by my own rules working here. He just didn't take any of them. He stayed loyal to a story that no longer matched the reality he was in. And when the conflict or rupture arrived, the moment meant to wake him up. He couldn't see it as feedback. He saw it as injustice. So what was going through my head during this mediation was a completely different story. The moment he sat down, I could feel the energy of it. This man was stubborn, dug in. He did not want to take responsibility for how his actions had contributed to his termination. He was holding on to the belief that everything happened to him and absolutely nothing happened because of him. And when someone is that anchored in victimhood, it creates a unique challenge in mediation. Because now it's not just about resolving a case, it's about finding a way to keep the employer invested in this resolution process when the employee refuses to acknowledge their part at all. So in these situations, as the mediator, I try to shift the entire frame. I don't anchor in what happened in the past because that loop will keep people stuck. Instead, I'll start asking questions about what they want tomorrow to look like, specifically the complainant. So what do you want tomorrow to look like? What do you want next month to look like? What do you want next year to look like? What they want to build, where they want to go. And this man, he had a vision. He had a business he was trying to get off the ground, but he felt defeated. Every time he talked about it, he added another layer of limitation. The season, the weather, the economy, the timing. He was baked into that. And you could hear the resignation with every explanation. So I use more of a Socratic method with him, which basically Socrates was a philosopher, and his method of getting to the truth was just asking a lot of questions. So I use that method with him gently, but, intentionally. I kept asking questions to get underneath the excuses and into the dream itself. Tell me about the business. What's the part of it that excites you? What would it look like if you actually had the space to try? And when he brought up the winter weather as a reason he couldn't move forward, I asked, well, how do other landscapers get through the winter? And he paused and then said, they do snow removal. So I asked, is that something that you would consider? And right there, I could feel like a door crack open, just enough for him to see that he wasn't stuck. He did have a path, he just hadn't claimed it. Maybe he didn't even want to do it, but just it opens the door to start thinking creatively. And here's the nuance that made all this even more meaningful. He still owed the company around $1,100 from a paycheck advance he never repaid, and the company was willing to write off that debt as part of a settlement. So I guided him slowly to see what that actually meant for him, that clearing this debt was momentum. It was a chance for him to channel all of his energy into the business he said he wanted and honestly acted on even when he was previously employed. Instead, when he was finally standing on the precipice of having this, he chose to stay in the loop of blame and disappointment. My whole goal was to help him shift from defending the old story to imagining a future that made him feel powerful again. Not by telling him what to do, but by asking the right questions and letting him hear his own possibilities out loud. And by the end of that mediation, he wasn't out of his pattern completely, but he wasn't trapped in it either. He could see an opening, a next step, a direction. And sometimes that's enough. Okay. So now we've gone into two cases that sit on opposite ends of the spectrum. In the drug test case, the conflict moved someone toward alignment. In the landscaper case, the conflict tried to walk the complainant through the doorway that the disruption opened for him, which is ironic because he was trying to kickstart his own landscaping business even when he did the work for this employer. So why not fully embrace the path when he was terminated? Instead, he unfortunately stayed in victim mentality. The case did not settle. So both show us the same truth. Conflict interrupts what's no longer aligned, but how you respond determines whether the conflict becomes a breakthrough or just the beginning of a repeat cycle. And that's really what this series is about. The drama's fun to explore, though I think the deeper truth that conflict is showing us is more revealing. It's always pointing you somewhere, and I think that's the most important point. The question is whether you fight the direction or follow it. Which brings me to something more important to understand about when we experience these types of ruptures and disruptions and conflicts ourselves. We need to start looking at them as signals, because they're going to show us where something in our life is shifting, where an old pattern is cracking, or where we're being nudged into a new direction, and whether you're ready for it or not, because it's going to happen anyway. Something also to consider is that they don't always look so dramatic or obvious. It can be easy to miss what they're pointing to. I want to give you 3 ways to recognize when a disruption is actually indicating movement and asking you to pay attention. The first clue is the emotional spike. So that would be those moments where your reaction feels way bigger than what's actually happening. You're suddenly irritated, restless, or anxious over something that on paper shouldn't even be that big of a deal. That's usually our system trying to wave us down to a deeper truth. It's not about necessarily the situation itself. It's about what the situation is pointing to. So when the reaction is disproportionate, that's a sign that something underneath is probably ready to shift. In the drug test case, that first clue, the emotional spike, showed up after the termination. He wasn't angry at the company. He was shaken by what the termination represented. It cracked open the stability he thought he had. And that emotional jolt is what finally made him look at his situation honestly and see that he had been stagnant, under-challenged, and selling himself short for probably years. And that spike, that termination, that emotional trigger woke him up. The second clue is repetition. You're going to notice the same themes showing up from different angles. You might have a similar conversation or a similar disappointment or similar boundary issue showing up all the time. When that pattern keeps resurfacing, try not to think of it as a coincidence. It's trying to get your attention over and over again. It's something in your life saying, you haven't addressed this yet, so let's try again. Repetition is guidance, right? And it's going to be dressed up as annoyance or irritation or something that's trying to get you to pay attention. And this was all over the landscaper story. He had a long history of pushing boundaries, disappearing on jobs, and assuming the rules bent around him. And every time his employers forgave it, absorbed it, or cleaned it up, that pattern repeated over and over until it finally couldn't. The conflict or fracture was the inevitable next chapter of a pattern he had refused to acknowledge. The third clue is the forced clarity. This is when you've avoided making a decision, avoided telling the truth, avoided acknowledging something, and suddenly the moment makes the choice for you. A job will end. A relationship will end. A dynamic will shift. And even though it feels disruptive, if you're honest, you realize you already knew. The conflict simply pulled the truth forward so you couldn't push it away anymore. This is actually present in both stories, but it shows up most clearly in the drug test case. He didn't choose to leave that job. He didn't feel ready to walk away, but the termination made the decision for him. And only in hindsight could he see that with clarity. He just couldn't act on it until the moment acted on him, right? And in the landscaper situation, the forced clarity could have opened a door, but he wasn't willing to walk through it. Life held up a mirror to him and said, this belief that you can bend the rules around you has expired now. But instead of seeing the moment as feedback, he saw it as attack. And that's what keeps a person stuck in the same cycle and not fully embracing his next chapter. Those three clues, the emotional spike, the repeating pattern, and the forced clarity, are always going to be right there. They're going to be opportunities for you to just walk through. Two people we saw today, two different conflicts, but the same invitations. The invitation to pay attention. Something is shifting. You're being moved. And that's really why I wanted to bring these cases forward today. They show just how supportive conflict actually is. These moments, these cracks, these rifts, these unexpected pivots open doorways we might never have walked through on our own. They give us fresh chances to choose differently, to step into something more aligned, and to move towards the next version of ourselves with more clarity than we had before. And when you can look at conflict through that lens, even the painful experiences begin to carry a bit of momentum. There's a sense that something is unfolding, something is shifting, something is making room for what comes next. And that is where I'm going to leave you today. I'll be bringing more of these real life cases into upcoming episodes because the more we look at these stories through this lens, the more we start to see why certain conflicts show up and when they do and where they're trying to move us. So many of us are still standing inside containers that don't quite fit anymore. The job we've outgrown, the role we've been playing for too long, the dynamic that hasn't shifted even though we have. And these fractures, these moments of tension or disruption are often the first signs that something in you is stretching beyond the walls you built years ago. The work is learning to recognize that in real time, you can move through it with more clarity, less friction. And my hope is a little excitement about what's trying to unfold. I hope this episode gave you something to reflect on. And as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you want me to weigh in on a conflict you're navigating, workplace, family, or anything in between, you can leave me a voicemail using the link in the show notes. I'll feature select questions in upcoming episodes. Until next week, don't react. respond with intention.